I knew the moment I walked into that dining room that nothing tonight would be ordinary. There was a weight in the air, thick and almost suffocating, like the room itself had been holding its breath for weeks, waiting for someone to light the fuse. And tonight it would be me. Or maybe it would be my son. I didn't yet know which. I only knew that the air between us had shifted. Every glance, every movement carried intention, some subtle, some sharp enough to cut. I could feel the tension coiling in my chest as I approached the table, polished wood gleaming under the chandelier, silverware perfectly aligned, as if order could somehow mask the storm gathering beneath the surface. Dinner was supposed to be a celebration, a milestone of sorts, but milestones are dangerous. They demand attention, they invite judgment, and they expose the cracks in a family as much as they highlight the successes. I sat down quietly, letting the formalities wash over me, the polite smiles, the muffled laughter, the clinking of glasses. But my attention wasn't on the wine or the roast beef. It was on the door. That door where my son and his wife would eventually appear, carrying more than themselves. They would carry intent, expectation, challenge. And I had already felt the tremor of it in the weeks leading up to tonight. The first course arrived, and I barely noticed the steaming plate before me. I forced a smile as I listened to my daughter-in-law recount some trivial anecdote, her voice light, almost innocent. But I had learned long ago to hear what was not being said. She was testing me, threading herself into my mind, planting seeds of overconfidence. I could feel her calculating every move, every glance, the way she positioned herself at the table, the casual ease with which she invaded space that, to her, wasn't mine to guard. I remembered the early days of building my company, when every corner of my office, every decision, every conversation carried stakes like this. Stakes I had taken seriously, stakes that had forged me into the man sitting here tonight. And then they walked in. My son arrived first, late enough to make an entrance but not so late as to seem careless. He carried himself with that familiar swagger, a confidence that had always been a little too polished, a little too performative. Behind him, his wife followed, moving as though the world had been waiting for her, eyes bright, posture impeccable. I didn't need words to understand the subtle message. We own this room now. And in that moment, I realized just how much I had underestimated the precision of their ambitions, the way they had been preparing for this confrontation long before we even knew it would come. We exchanged pleasantries, though my voice carried more civility than warmth. My mind wandered briefly to the early mornings and late nights, the missed birthdays, the business trips, the sacrifices my wife and I had made to ensure our son could walk into this life with privilege. I wondered, not for the first time, if we had built him too comfortable, if we had sculpted entitlement without discipline. And yet, as I studied him across the table, I recognized the familiar fire in his eyes. The same fire I had when I first signed the leases, hired the first employees, fought every obstacle that threatened to collapse what I had built. But unlike me, his fire was impatient, impulsive, untamed by experience. That fire was about to ignite a storm. The conversation turned to the company, as I had expected it would. Casual questions about projects, subtle comments about strategic decisions. And then the line dropped. Unforgiving. Irrevocable. Make my wife a partner, or get out of my company. Time slowed. I felt it in the way the room went still, the clatter of cutlery fading, the hum of the chandelier seeming louder than it had seconds ago. I sat frozen for a heartbeat, letting the words settle into the air, into the space between us. Everyone at the table froze, friends, family, advisors, witnesses to what had just been declared. I measured my response carefully, weighing the implications, feeling the familiar pulse of authority pulse in my veins. But I didn't speak. Not yet. I never speak until I understand the full measure of what has been cast into my world. Silence, I reminded myself, is as much a weapon as words. And I had learned how to wield it better than anyone. My son leaned back slightly, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He believed he had already won. He believed he had cornered me, that the foundation of my authority had crumbled. He didn't realize how well I knew the architecture of that foundation, the unseen reinforcements, the clauses, the rights that I held quietly but firmly. He thought this was a battle of wills when it was, in truth, a battle of knowledge and patience. I let him believe he had the advantage for a moment longer. Let the arrogance settle in. It was always easier to correct someone when they were sure of their victory. I allowed my eyes to drift to my daughter-in-law. Her smile had hardened into something sharper now, subtle and precise, like a blade hidden in velvet. She assumed that because she had charm and social leverage, she could bend reality to her favor. But I had spent decades shaping reality. I had learned to bend it, to twist it, to survive every challenge, every betrayal, every person who thought they could outmaneuver me. And now, across this gleaming table, in this orchestrated performance of civility and power, I could feel the moment of reckoning approaching. The storm hadn't yet broken, but the clouds had aligned. I reflected, almost clinically, on the years that had led to this night. The investments made, the employees trusted, the mentorships given and sometimes betrayed. I thought about the son I raised, the one I had nurtured, protected, taught to negotiate, to challenge, to command. And here he was, facing me with that education weaponized against me. It was the same fire I had once wielded, now turned outward. I recognized the brilliance of it, even as I bristled at the audacity. Perhaps that is what parenthood often is, watching the reflection of yourself, polished by youth and ignorance, aimed at you with full force. And yet, beneath the simmering tension, a deeper thought surfaced. Tonight was more than confrontation. Tonight was revelation. If handled correctly, it could clarify boundaries, establish respect, and illuminate truths long hidden under polite smiles and family traditions. I couldn't allow rashness, because rashness always costs more than it seems. I had learned that the hard way, in ways that had left scars invisible to the world but etched into my own sense of identity. I leaned back, letting the silence stretch like a taut wire between us. I could see the slight tightening of the son's jaw, the subtle shifting of the wife's weight as if she were preparing for an ambush that would never come. I let them wait. I let them wonder. Let them feel the uncertainty, the imbalance that comes from underestimating someone who has built an empire not with luck, but with persistence and foresight. I wasn't about to speak yet. My words needed weight, purpose, and the perfect timing to land with impact. Dinner continued in eerie calm. Forks moved, wine glasses clinked, laughter occasionally erupted, but it was hollow, brittle, failing to mask the undercurrent of conflict. Every bite I took, every sip, was measured, deliberate. I watched my son closely, noting every flicker of expression, every subtle shift that betrayed confidence wavering. The wife watched me as well, confident, calculating, convinced she had the upper hand. But I was patient. Patience was a weapon I had mastered long ago, and tonight, it would serve me well. As I set my glass down, I allowed a thought to drift. In the days to come, I would have to confront not just my son, but the illusion of control he carried. I would have to remind him, and perhaps myself, that legacy isn't a gift freely given. It is tested, challenged, and earned. And tonight, the first test had begun. The table was set, the pieces in motion, and somewhere beneath the polite exterior, the war had already begun. I exhaled slowly, letting the tension pulse through me one last time, and prepared for what was coming next. The silence stretched, waiting for the spark that would ignite everything, and I could feel, with that quiet certainty, that this night would change everything. The moment after my son's words hung in the air, a strange stillness fell over the room. It was almost surreal. The clinking of silverware paused midair, the hum of the chandelier seemed to hold its breath, and the very walls felt like they were leaning in to listen. I sat there, letting the silence do what words never could, make the room understand the gravity of what had just been declared. It was a delicate weapon, this quiet. One that could wound as deeply as a shout if used with precision. I watched my son, noticing the brief flicker in his eyes, a hesitation that he quickly masked with the same smirk he always wore. That smirk had always been his armor, but tonight, I could see the cracks forming under the pressure. He believed he had cornered me, that my silence was weakness. He was wrong. Silence is not emptiness. Silence is strategy. And I had been patient enough to master it long ago. My mind wandered back to the early days, days of endless calls, sleepless nights, and the constant pressure of keeping a fledgling company alive. Every decision I made then had carried the weight of everything I was building. That weight had taught me to listen, to calculate, to wait. And now, decades later, I was applying the same principle here, across a polished table, against someone I had raised myself. There was a bitter irony in that, one that I acknowledged without shame. I could feel my daughter-in-law's gaze on me, sharp, curious, confident. She had assumed control the moment she entered the room. Her posture, the tilt of her chin, the subtle challenges in her voice, they all screamed that she believed she was untouchable. But I had learned long ago that confidence without depth is brittle. I let her think she had already won. Let her lean on assumptions. Every second of her overconfidence was another thread I could unravel when the time was right. The silence stretched, long and deliberate. I let my thoughts drift over all the things unsaid. The sacrifices my wife and I had made, the late nights building a company from nothing, the employees who had trusted us blindly, the deals won and lost. And most of all, the son I had raised, the one who had been taught negotiation, resilience, and strategy, now stood across from me, wielding all of that knowledge like a weapon. I felt both pride and caution. This was the culmination of my guidance twisted into challenge. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. The room was tense, the air thick with anticipation. My son finally spoke, a calculated tone masking the tension behind his words. "I'm just asking for what's fair." The word hung in the air, like a challenge, a subtle accusation. I didn't respond immediately. I let it linger, letting him sit with the weight of his own statement. Because fairness, like power, is subjective, and tonight the measure of both was mine to define. I thought about patience, about timing, about restraint. In the business world, hasty decisions can destroy empires. In the personal world, impulsive reactions can destroy relationships. Here, at this table, everything I had learned was being tested, not just my authority, but my understanding of legacy, respect, and identity. And I realized that tonight, the lesson I had to impart was not one of anger or control, but of awareness. They had walked into a house built on patience, and they were about to understand why that mattered. My daughter-in-law shifted slightly, a subtle indication of impatience, perhaps annoyance. She assumed that movement could destabilize me, but she had underestimated how deeply I had internalized control. Every inch of her confidence, every calculated glance, every poised smile was being absorbed, cataloged, and assessed. I was not here to react. I was here to decide, and that decision would come at the precise moment it carried the most weight. I allowed myself a moment of reflection, leaning back in my chair. I thought about my son as a boy, the first time he tried to assert control in the playground, the first time he negotiated to get what he wanted from a teacher or a friend. That same determination was here now, but it had matured, or so he thought, into a form capable of challenging me. He had learned the techniques. He had not yet learned the foundation upon which authority rests. And tonight he was about to learn. I observed the subtle shifts in the room. Advisors exchanging glances, employees fidgeting, the slight tightening in the corners of my son's mouth. Silence had done its work. It had created doubt, it had demanded attention, and it had asserted power without a single word. That is the art of the weapon I wielded tonight. And in the quiet, I felt a strange clarity. This confrontation was not about who was right or wrong. It was about control, respect, and the boundaries of legacy. The conversation resumed superficially, polite questions about business, trivial comments about recent successes. But beneath it, a deeper current flowed. I could sense the hesitation, the unspoken calculations. Each smile, each casual laugh, each nod carried weight, and I measured it all. The silence I maintained forced everyone to listen in a way that words alone could never achieve. My son's smirk faltered, just slightly, and I recognized it immediately. That was all I needed to know. The seed of doubt had been planted. I reflected on the broader lesson of this night. Patience, restraint, timing, they were as crucial in life as they were in business. And in this intimate arena of family, where pride and emotion intertwine, they were even more powerful. I had to remember that victory was not in the confrontation itself, but in the realization it provoked. And tonight, realization would come, not through argument, but through quiet, deliberate observation. As the courses continued, I felt the tension settle into a rhythm, each tick of the clock marking the slow accumulation of awareness. My son leaned forward subtly, my daughter-in-law's smile never fully faltering, but both were becoming aware that silence can speak louder than the loudest demand. And I, sitting in quiet command, felt a surge of control that was calm, measured, and unshakable. The war had begun, yes, but it was being fought on my terms. Finally, as dessert was served, I allowed a thought to crystallize in my mind. Tonight, they would learn that control is earned, that legacy is not granted by loud demands or confident smirks, and that silence, when wielded with purpose, is more devastating than any confrontation. The first test had been administered. The table had been set for war, and I had made sure that I was the one holding the map. Watching my son across the table, I felt a strange mixture of pride and apprehension. There was a fire in his eyes, one I recognized immediately, the same fire that had once burned in me when I was younger, relentless and unafraid. But it was raw, untamed, lacking the patience and wisdom that experience brings. I realized that while I had taught him negotiation, strategy, and ambition, I had not fully prepared him for the weight of responsibility. And now that gap was staring me in the face, disguised as confidence, as challenge, as audacity. The room had settled into a fragile calm, though the tension never truly left. Conversations around us continued, polite and measured, but I felt every glance, every subtle shift, every unspoken calculation. My son leaned back, arms crossed, waiting for my reaction, expecting my words to falter or my authority to waver. He did not yet understand that authority is not about force. It is about perception, patience, and the quiet understanding that experience can command. I allowed myself a moment to reflect on the years that led us here. The long nights in the office, the sacrifices my wife and I made to ensure our son had every advantage, the lessons taught and the freedoms granted. I realized, with a twinge of regret, that in striving to provide him comfort and opportunity, I had neglected to instill a sense of the boundaries that define leadership. Ambition without wisdom can be dangerous, I thought, and now I was seeing the consequences firsthand. He spoke, carefully measured, trying to mask the uncertainty I knew was there. "You taught me how to negotiate," he said, his voice calm but edged with expectation. "I'm just applying what I learned." I felt a flicker of recognition and frustration. Yes, I had taught him well, but he had weaponized those lessons without understanding the foundation on which they rested. I could not fault him for ambition, but I had to correct the imbalance, and I knew the correction would need to be subtle, precise, and unassailable. I let my thoughts wander briefly, recalling the boy he had been, the one who would demand fairness on the playground, who would argue, bargain, and fight for what he wanted. That determination had been nurtured and shaped into the man sitting here. But ambition without comprehension of consequence is like fire without boundaries. It burns, and it can consume everything in its path. I understood the brilliance of his strategy, even as I bristled at the audacity. There was a lesson to be imparted, and it would be delivered with the weight of experience rather than anger. I observed the subtle dynamics between my son and his wife. She was confident, poised, convinced of her leverage, and he leaned on her assurance as if it strengthened his position. But I knew that confidence without foundation is fragile. Her smirk, her calculated glances, even the light touch of her hand on his arm, these were gestures of assumed dominance, illusions she believed were real. And tonight, those illusions would be tested. I let my gaze drift around the room, noticing the advisors and family members, their polite expressions hiding curiosity, doubt, and anticipation. The room had become an arena, and while my son thought he had challenged me, the reality was that the stage was set for me to teach a different lesson. A lesson about authority, about respect, about what it truly means to inherit more than just a title. The conversation resumed superficially. Questions about projects, subtle mentions of investment decisions, remarks about team performance. But beneath the words, a battle of perception raged. I noted every hesitation, every micro-expression, every flicker of doubt or overconfidence. Silence remained my ally, allowing me to absorb, analyze, and prepare. It was a weapon, a shield, and a lens through which I could see the truth of what was unfolding. My son's voice broke through my reflections again, this time slightly more strained, less confident. "You raised me to lead," he said, almost pleading, as if reminding me of a debt owed. "I'm just stepping into that role." I felt the weight of that statement. And yet, leadership is not a mantle to be claimed through assertion alone. It is earned through understanding, through patience, through grasping the consequences of each choice. I realized that tonight, my responsibility was not just to protect my authority, but to guide him toward that understanding. It was a delicate balance, firm, unyielding, yet not cruel. I allowed my internal monologue to stretch, to absorb the lessons of both past and present. I thought about the foundations of my company, the trust of my employees, the intricacies of power that are invisible to those who have never held it. All of these were lessons he had yet to fully appreciate. And tonight, the exposure to reality would begin. He would understand that negotiation, ambition, and entitlement are only effective when grounded in knowledge, patience, and perspective. I leaned back slightly, meeting his gaze directly, letting the room feel the quiet intensity of my attention. He shifted, a subtle sign that my silence and calm were beginning to register. He had expected confrontation, resistance, or surrender, but instead, he found a measured observer, a father whose authority did not need to be asserted loudly to be undeniable. The tension in his shoulders, the small twitch in his smirk, it all told me that the first seeds of comprehension were being planted. I thought, almost coldly, about the broader lesson. Parenthood is not just about giving. It is about testing, challenging, and guiding. Tonight was a crucible, a moment where the son would see the man he aspired to become and understand the difference between raw ambition and tempered authority. I would not coddle, I would not submit, and I would not react rashly. Instead, I would allow the truth to unfold naturally through observation, patience, and the subtle assertion of experience. As the room continued its delicate dance of conversation and polite tension, I felt a quiet satisfaction. The fire in my son's eyes had been acknowledged, and the boundaries of reality were beginning to make themselves felt. He would not leave this table unchanged. And neither would his wife. The lesson had begun, the chessboard was set, and I was already several moves ahead. I allowed myself a final reflection as the evening progressed. The son I raised had grown into a man capable of challenge, but not yet capable of understanding the full measure of what he sought to control. And that understanding would come, not through force, but through the patient, deliberate unfolding of truth. The war was just beginning, and the first real test of character, authority, and legacy had only just been administered. I noticed at the instant she smiled, the subtle curl at the corner of her lips, the almost imperceptible lift of an eyebrow. A smirk that carried confidence, yes, but more importantly, one that betrayed assumption. She believed she had orchestrated the perfect scenario, that her presence and charm had tilted the scales of control in her favor. I studied it closely, and in that moment, I understood the depth of her miscalculation. Confidence without foundation is a fragile thing, and hers was teetering precariously on the edge. The air at the table felt electric, charged with unspoken intentions and concealed strategies. My son, sensing her assurance, leaned slightly forward, eyes gleaming with anticipation. He had done the calculations, rehearsed the lines, and expected a reaction that would falter under pressure. But he had underestimated the quiet authority of someone who had built empires, who had survived every challenge through foresight and patience. I didn't need to speak yet, the silence itself was beginning to shift the balance. I allowed my mind to wander briefly, reflecting on the company's history, the contracts signed, the partnerships formed, the subtle clauses that were invisible to anyone who did not understand the architecture of authority. All of these were lessons I had internalized, and now they were weapons in their own right. I could see the subtle signs of overconfidence in both my son and his wife. Their smirk and posture were loud declarations of assumed victory, but assumptions can be dangerous when reality intervenes. As the evening progressed, I observed the subtle interplay of power. Advisors and family members exchanged glances, sensing the tension but unsure of how it would resolve. My son's confidence was beginning to waver in small, almost imperceptible ways. The tightening of a jaw, the flicker in an eye, the brief hesitation before responding. And yet, outwardly, he maintained the same composure he had rehearsed. I let him believe it was enough. The conversation turned back to business, each sentence a calculated test, each question a probe into my reaction. "We've done so much for the company," my daughter-in-law remarked, her tone light but carrying the weight of expectation. "It only makes sense to formalize my role now." I listened, letting the words sink in without immediate response. The subtle confidence in her voice was revealing, exposing the cracks in her argument even as she tried to mask them. I realized that her smirk was not just a display of arrogance, it was a clue. The moment of revelation was close, and I could see it forming in the alignment of their assumptions, the overconfidence, and the reliance on leverage that did not truly exist. I reflected on the nature of power and perception. My son and his wife had been calculating, strategic, and careful, but they had misjudged one crucial element: experience. Knowledge without wisdom can create the illusion of control, but it cannot withstand the quiet assertion of authority built over decades. I allowed my silence to stretch, to let them feel the pressure of unseen depth, of foundations they could not touch, and of the patience of someone who had weathered every storm. I leaned back slightly, observing the subtle cues around the table. The advisor's polite interest, the flicker of awareness in my son's posture, the brief tightening of my daughter-in-law's fingers on her glass. The smirk had given it away. She believed she held the advantage, and in doing so, she had revealed the vulnerability beneath her confidence. This was a gift, a small but decisive insight that I could leverage when the time was right. I allowed my thoughts to drift to the broader lesson. Perception can be manipulated, confidence can be feigned, and charm can be wielded as a weapon, but reality is grounded in substance. And tonight, substance was mine. Every word spoken, every gesture made, every assumption held by those across the table was now visible, mapped, cataloged, and ready for response. Patience would dictate the timing, and clarity would dictate the impact. I caught my son's gaze briefly. There was a flicker of recognition, the hint of a question forming in his eyes. Had he miscalculated? Perhaps. But even if he hadn't fully realized it, the seed of doubt had been planted. And in battles like this, doubt is often more powerful than confrontation. It causes hesitation, reconsideration, and ultimately, submission to reality. The rest of the evening continued in a delicate balance, polite conversation overlaying a battlefield of intentions. I maintained my focus, noting the subtle cues, the unspoken challenges, and the slight shifts in confidence. The smirk that had first caught my attention remained, but it was beginning to lose its edge. Confidence without substance cannot sustain itself when measured against quiet authority and years of experience. I allowed a brief moment of reflection, thinking about the architecture of my decisions, the layers of protection, and the subtle control mechanisms that I had built over decades. They were invisible to those who had not earned the knowledge to see them, yet tonight, they would shape the outcome. The smirk was a signal, a warning, and a clue. It had given away more than she knew, and I intended to use that insight to restore balance, clarity, and authority. Finally, as the dessert plates were cleared and the room settled into a quieter rhythm, I felt the first stirrings of an opening, a moment where words could be spoken that would shift the entire dynamic. The smirk had revealed the truth. Confidence without foundation is fragile, and the house of assumed power they had entered was built on observation, patience, and unseen authority. The war was moving into its next phase, and I was ready. I felt the weight of legacy pressing down on me as I sat at the table, watching my son and his wife. Not just the company, not just the business decisions or financial outcomes, but the legacy of authority, of respect, of principles I had built over decades. Every glance, every gesture, every word exchange tonight carried more than intention. It carried history, expectation, and consequence. The weight of what I had created, and what I had yet to protect, settled squarely on my shoulders. My son, emboldened by his wife's presence and his own rehearsed confidence, leaned slightly forward. "We're only asking for what's fair," he said, the words carefully measured, but underneath them I could detect the tension. He was testing boundaries, probing for weakness, gauging the limits of my patience. I had taught him to negotiate, to assert himself, to wield ambition as a weapon, but he had yet to learn that legacy is not simply a prize to be claimed. It is responsibility, earned over time, weighed against consequence, and understood through perspective. I let the silence stretch, letting him sit with the magnitude of what he had just said. Patience is a tool as sharp as any sword, and tonight, it was my weapon. I could see the subtle cracks forming in his composure, the slight tension around the eyes, the tightening of his jaw, the micro-shifts in posture. Confidence unchecked often reveals its own fragility, and I was learning just how brittle the surface of his conviction could be. My mind wandered to the past, to the sacrifices and decisions that had shaped the foundation upon which our family and our company stood. The early mornings, the late nights, the deals that had required precision, insight, and unwavering patience. I had built more than a company. I had built a framework of values, of discipline, of respect for the work required to sustain success. And now, my son and his wife were trying to navigate that framework as though it were a map to entitlement rather than a test of character. She smiled again, subtly, almost imperceptibly, a signal of confidence and assumed leverage. But I had noticed it before, the smirk that betrayed her assumptions, the small cues that revealed her overestimation of control. Confidence without foundation is fragile. She believed she held the advantage, and in that belief, she had revealed the truth about her position. And the realization that legacy carries weight far beyond the superficial assumptions of the moment began to settle over the table. I allowed myself a moment of reflection, thinking about the son I had raised, the man he was becoming, and the lessons he had yet to fully grasp. Leadership is not a title. It is not an inherited position or a superficial display of power. It is a responsibility to uphold principles, to honor relationships, to balance ambition with wisdom. The weight of legacy is the weight of understanding, and it is heavier than any negotiation or confident declaration. The conversation drifted to company strategy, yet every word, every question, every suggestion carried unspoken implications. I listened carefully, analyzing their assumptions, noting the subtle misalignments in logic and perception. Each exchange revealed the depth, or shallowness, of their understanding. I could see the calculations in their eyes, the anticipation of victory, and the hidden fears they tried to mask. And through it all, the weight of legacy anchored me, reminding me that authority is not granted, it is upheld through awareness, patience, and the ability to perceive the true measure of challenge. My son spoke again, a touch more earnest this time. "You taught me to lead, to make decisions. I'm just stepping into that role." I acknowledged his words internally. Yes, I had given him tools, but the depth of their application had been incomplete. Leadership is tested in moments of real consequence, not rehearsed dialogues or confident assertions. And tonight, the first lessons were being learned, whether consciously or not. The table had become a crucible where lessons were forged, intentions revealed, and character measured against the reality of inherited responsibility. I watched them both carefully, seeing the subtle shifts, the micro-expressions that betrayed awareness creeping in. The smirk had softened slightly, the confidence became tinged with doubt. These small, almost imperceptible changes signaled that the lesson of legacy was beginning to take hold. Control, authority, and respect cannot be demanded. They must be recognized, understood, and honored. That recognition was starting to form, right here, across this polished table. As dessert plates were cleared, I allowed myself a quiet internal calculation. Every word, every gesture from this point forward would carry intentional weight. The legacy of decades, the lessons of experience, the framework of authority I had built, these were all tools I could use to guide them toward understanding without diminishing dignity. Legacy is not wielded as punishment. It is demonstrated through measured, deliberate action. I met my son's gaze and held it, letting the weight of history, expectation, and consequence flow silently between us. The battle was not one of dominance, but of awareness. He would come to understand that ambition must be tempered by insight, that confidence must be anchored in reality, and that legacy is not a possession to be demanded, it is a responsibility to be upheld. The night was far from over, but the first lessons had been planted. The smirk, the confident tone, the poised gestures, they had all revealed their intentions, and in doing so, provided the clarity I needed. Legacy, I thought, is a quiet force, subtle yet undeniable, and tonight, its weight was settling firmly on the minds of those who believed they were unassailable. And as I sat back, letting the room absorb the tension and the unspoken authority, I knew the next moves would define not just the outcome of this evening, but the understanding of what it truly means to inherit responsibility. I could feel it, the subtle shift in the room, the tension tightening like a bowstring ready to release. The earlier games, the calculated smirks, the confident words, all had led to this. Something in my son had changed in the past hour. The bravado, the rehearsed confidence, the sense that he could assert entitlement with a few well-chosen phrases, it was beginning to crack. I could see it in the slight tremor of his hands, the micro-expression in his eyes, the brief hesitation before speaking. The breaking point was near, and I had been waiting for it. Dinner had progressed into the later courses, the conversation a delicate dance of polite inquiries and carefully veiled challenges. I had remained largely silent, letting the weight of experience, authority, and observation do its work. Silence, I reminded myself, is a weapon sharper than any words. It forces reflection, creates doubt, and reveals hidden truths. And now, after hours of subtle maneuvering, its effect was visible. My daughter-in-law shifted slightly in her seat, trying to maintain composure, but I could sense the tension in her posture, the way her smile faltered just enough to betray uncertainty. She had believed she had orchestrated the perfect scenario, that charm and confidence could tilt the balance in her favor. But she had misjudged the power of deliberate observation. Confidence without substance is fragile, and her foundation was beginning to crumble. I watched my son closely, noticing the tiny movements that spoke louder than any declaration. A twitch in his jaw, a momentary frown, the way his eyes darted briefly, signals that he was beginning to question, to doubt, to reassess. This is the moment when lessons are learned, when reality pierces through assumption and the true measure of authority is revealed. He leaned forward slightly, voice quieter than before, a hint of hesitation threading through his tone. I just thought. He paused, caught mid-thought by the weight of unspoken truths that had been accumulating all evening. I'm trying to step into a role you've taught me to occupy. I let his words hang in the air, allowing the gravity of their implications to settle. I had raised him to negotiate, to strategize, to lead, but not to assume that leadership was an entitlement. Leadership is responsibility, and responsibility is earned, proven through experience, patience, and the understanding of consequences. That lesson, he was beginning to realize, could not be rushed. I reflected briefly on the path that had led us here. Years of building a company from the ground up, countless decisions weighed and measured, the cultivation of authority and trust among employees, partners, and family. The legacy I had created was not fragile, it was tested, fortified by every challenge faced and overcome. Yet, watching him now, I realized that part of my role as a father was to ensure he understood the true weight of what he aspired to inherit. The room was silent, every observer aware that something pivotal was occurring. Even the advisors, trained to navigate boardroom battles, could sense the shift. The tension was no longer just familial. It had become a study in perception, authority, and the collision of ambition with reality. I let my eyes sweep the table slowly, noting every reaction, every flicker of comprehension, every micro-expression of realization. The breaking point was not just his, it was ours collectively, a moment where truth, authority, and understanding would converge. I decided it was time to speak, to test the moment further. My voice was calm, measured, deliberate. Leadership is not claimed by demand. It is recognized by understanding, earned through responsibility, and upheld by action. He flinched slightly at the weight of the words, a micro-expression betraying that the lesson had begun to penetrate. My daughter-in-law's smirk had faded entirely now, replaced by a careful, almost wary consideration. The overconfidence that had dominated their interactions was dissipating, replaced by a dawning awareness that control is never assumed. It is demonstrated, observed, and respected. I leaned forward slightly, letting the intensity of my gaze communicate what words alone could not. You have learned to negotiate, to assert, to push, but negotiation without comprehension, assertion without insight, and pushing without understanding only reveals inexperience. Remember that tonight. The room was still. My son's posture had changed subtly, shoulders dropping a fraction, jaw relaxing, eyes reflecting the weight of reflection rather than defiance. He had reached the threshold where understanding begins, the breaking point that separates assumption from realization. The first true lesson had landed, and it was undeniable. I allowed myself a brief internal exhale. The confrontation had moved beyond words and superficial challenges. It had become an education in patience, authority, and legacy. My son and his wife were beginning to grasp that power, entitlement, and confidence are meaningless without the foundation of experience, observation, and responsibility. That is the breaking point, the moment when perception yields to reality, when arrogance meets authority, and when lessons, long taught but often ignored, finally take root. As the final plates were cleared, and the room settled into a quieter rhythm, I felt a sense of accomplishment tempered with caution. The breaking point had been reached, not in anger, not in confrontation, but in recognition. They had begun to see, truly see, the depth of what they were challenging. And I knew, with quiet certainty, that the next steps in this battle would be guided not by impulse, but by understanding, reflection, and the weight of legacy. I rose from my seat, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room, every expectation, every assumption pressing down like the tension before a storm breaks. My son's challenge, his wife's smirk, the carefully rehearsed lines, they all converged in this moment, and I knew that my response would set the course for everything that followed. I had waited for this moment, prepared for it, and now it was mine to define. The room went silent as I moved toward them, each step deliberate, measured, full of intent. My son's eyes widened slightly, that confident mask beginning to falter. He had expected confrontation, perhaps resistance, but not this calm, unyielding assertion of presence. My daughter-in-law's smirk, once so sure, wavered. There was an almost imperceptible shift, a micro-expression of uncertainty that betrayed the beginning of realization. She believed she held power. I was about to show her that perception without substance is fragile. I stopped before her, feeling the intensity of the moment settle like a weight between us. Every detail mattered, the angle of my gaze, the cadence of my breath, the calm in my posture. I spoke, and my voice carried the authority of decades, tempered by patience, experience, and quiet confidence. Respect is earned. Authority is recognized. And entitlement is never granted by demand. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. My son's jaw tightened, but there was a flicker of comprehension now, the first hint that the lesson had begun to take root. My daughter-in-law's smile faded entirely, replaced by a cautious consideration. She had assumed control, but now she was realizing that the house she had entered was built on foundations she could not see, lessons she could not circumvent, and authority she had yet to respect. I let a pause stretch between us, allowing the weight of my words to sink in. Silence can be a weapon, as I had shown throughout the evening, and in this moment, it reinforced every assertion I had made. The subtle power in the quiet, the tension of anticipation, and the weight of history all converged to create a realization that words alone could not fully convey. They were beginning to understand the depth of what they had challenged. My son spoke, his voice lower, hesitant, stripped of rehearsed confidence. I didn't realize. He didn't finish, and I didn't need him to. The incompleteness of his sentence carried more meaning than any elaboration could. Recognition, comprehension, and the dawning awareness of responsibility are often incomplete at first, leaving space for reflection and growth. This was precisely the moment I had been waiting for, the the turning point where awareness begins to transform ambition into understanding and confidence into respect. I straightened, letting the presence I had cultivated over decades fill the space, asserting authority without aggression, commanding attention without confrontation. "You will learn," I said, calm but firm, "that legacy is not a possession to be claimed, but a responsibility to be upheld. Every decision, every action, every interaction carries weight." Tonight was only the beginning of understanding that truth. The room remained quiet, the advisors and family members sensing that the moment had shifted. My son's posture relaxed slightly, the tension in his shoulders giving way to contemplation. His wife, still poised, had begun to recognize that control without comprehension is unstable. The smirk, the posture, the confident assertions, all had been tested against the reality of experience and patience. And for the first time, the reality was winning. I allowed myself a brief internal reflection. This was not just a victory of authority, but a lesson in growth, understanding, and perspective. My son and his wife had been challenged not through anger, not through domination, but through measured presence, calculated patience, and the subtle force of truth. This is the power of legacy. It teaches, it corrects, and it endures. And tonight it was doing precisely that. As I returned to my seat, the room seemed to exhale collectively, the tension shifting into a quieter rhythm of comprehension and reflection. The stand I had taken was not merely a defense of authority, it was a demonstration, a lesson, a catalyst for awareness. The smirk had faded, the confidence had been tempered, and the table had witnessed a transformation. They had begun to understand the depth of what they were challenging, and the evening had reached a turning point. I leaned back, feeling the subtle shift in energy, noting the thoughtful expressions, the reconsidered assumptions, the small gestures of acknowledgement. The war had moved to a new phase, not one of confrontation, but of understanding. My presence, my patience, and my authority had redirected the course of the evening, establishing clarity and respect. And in that quiet, deliberate assertion, I recognized the profound truth. Some battles are won not through conflict, but through the deliberate, unshakable stand of those who understand the weight of legacy. The room was quiet now, not the tense silence of confrontation, but the calm that follows clarity. The battle of words, glances, and unspoken calculations had reached its conclusion, leaving in its wake a profound sense of understanding. My son and his wife sat across from me, both changed in subtle but undeniable ways. The smirk was gone, replaced by careful consideration. Confidence remained, but it was tempered with respect, a recognition that authority and legacy are not assumed, they are understood and honored. I allowed myself a moment to breathe, reflecting on the lessons that had unfolded over the course of the evening. Patience, observation, and measured presence had turned the tide, transforming a challenge into an opportunity for growth. My son had begun to comprehend the weight of the legacy I had entrusted to him, the responsibilities that accompanied ambition, and the depth of understanding required to lead with integrity. My daughter-in-law, too, had been forced to recognize that influence without foundation is fragile, and that respect is earned through awareness and consideration. The tension had dissipated, replaced by a quiet respect that was palpable even without words. Conversations resumed, lighter this time, tinged with reflection rather than challenge. Advisors and family members exchanged knowing glances, sensing that the evening had shifted from confrontation to comprehension. The table, once a battlefield, was now a space of acknowledgement of lessons learned, authority recognized, and growth initiated. I watched my son, noting the subtle changes in posture, the micro-expressions of realization, the way his eyes now sought understanding rather than assumption. He had been tested, guided, and corrected, not through force, but through the deliberate assertion of presence, patience, and experience. This was the essence of leadership, to challenge, to guide, and to allow the truth of responsibility to take hold. He was beginning to grasp it, and that comprehension was worth more than any victory achieved through confrontation alone. My daughter-in-law's demeanor had also shifted. The initial confidence that had bordered on arrogance had given way to thoughtful consideration. She now recognized that influence without substance is fleeting, that authority is not claimed by presence or assertiveness alone, and that the lessons of experience are the ultimate foundation for understanding. The subtle cues, the softened gaze, the slight shift in posture, the measured tones of conversation, revealed a new awareness, a respect for the forces at play, and an acknowledgement that legacy carries weight far beyond immediate control. I reflected on the evening as a whole. The confrontation had been necessary, the lessons deliberate, and the timing impeccable. The breaking points, the subtle reveals, the careful calibrations of silence and presence, all had converged to produce comprehension and growth. The war at the table had been fought and won, not through dominance, but through the quiet assertion of authority and the patient unfolding of truth. As I rose to leave the table, the room seemed to exhale collectively, a release of tension that carried relief, understanding, and reflection. My son followed my lead, no words needed, the acknowledgement evident in the subtle nod and measured movements. My daughter-in-law, too, mirrored the transition, her posture now respectful, her expressions tempered with awareness. The evening had changed them, reshaped their assumptions, and instilled lessons that would endure far longer than any argument or confrontation could have achieved. I took a moment to savor the silence that followed, the silence after victory, after clarity, after understanding. It was a profound, resonant quiet, one that spoke of lessons learned, authority recognized, and respect earned. The table, once a battlefield, had become a testament to the power of patience, presence, and deliberate action. In that stillness, I recognized the culmination of the evening, the realization that true empowerment comes not from asserting dominance, but from guiding others to comprehend the depth of responsibility, legacy, and authority. And as the house settled into the calm of the night, I felt a quiet satisfaction. The son I had raised was beginning to understand the man he was meant to become, the daughter-in-law was beginning to grasp the importance of substance over appearance, and the legacy I had built was secure, not through force, but through the careful, deliberate application of wisdom. The silence after victory was more powerful than any words, more enduring than any gesture, and infinitely more instructive than any confrontation. Tonight, understanding had won. Tonight, the table had spoken.